Welcome back to Brothers to Grimhammer. Tonight we're doing some lore and theory covering the two lost Primarchs. Now, there's not a ton of lore regarding them, but there's still tons to go over. As always, I want to thank you guys for the support. Be sure to like, comment any ideas you want to see. Usually I'll be sure to do them, and be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. Can't forget that, it's very important. As always, let's get into the video.
It always begins with what is missing. In an age defined by excess, by overabundance of war and of dogma, the most terrible thing is not the killing, not the burning, not the shrieking choir of worlds as they die beneath orbital fire. The most terrible thing is the quiet place where something should be and is not. In the age of the Imperium, where every regiment has a number and every war zone an approved designation, the deepest wound is not a battlefield, but a gap in the record. The Emperor of mankind made a perfect pattern. That is the creed. It is a lie, of course, but it is a lie that holds the galaxy together. He forged a plan across the ashes of old night, a grand design that stretched from the cradle of terror to the lightless edges of the galactic halo. 20 gene-crafted suns as the keystones, 20 legions of transhuman warriors as the pillars of a new dominion, a host of mortal armies and engines marching beneath their banners. It is an image repeated across murals and cathedrals and devotional canticles from one side of the Imperium to the other. 20 golden lights in the darkness, 20 names to be chanted, 20 faces to be sculpted, 20 legions to be remembered. Except there are not 20. There are 18. And 2 absences that hurt more than any presence. In the oldest, deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, there is a hall that only a handful of living beings have ever seen and walked. In your mind, picture it even if you have no right to be there, a grand artery of stone and gold running through the heart of Terra's greatest fortress, its spine formed of colossal plinths flanking the passage in perfect, tyrannical symmetry. On each rests a statue, a monument carved by master artisans, who later died with their tongues torn out because they saw too much. Demigods in marble and adamant, captured mid-march or mid-battle, wreathed in stone fire and robes, their faces idealized and yet recognizable. 18 figures, 2 plinths, stand bare. There is no broken statuary there, no toppled body left smashed to remind the viewer of some ancient disgrace. The pedestals are not ruined, they are immaculate. They have been polished, re-sanctified, and then carefully left empty. No inscription, no sigil, no discreet little data slate noting that a monument once stood here. Nothing. The custodians who walk past them do not pause. They do not look up. The companions of the Emperor are trained to ignore those absences as thoroughly as they ignore their own mortality. To stand in that hall is to feel a conceptual cold, as if reality itself knows that 2 massive shapes once cast shadows here, and now do not. Once, there were 20 Primarchs. That much even the most dogmatic of ecclesiarchs cannot comfortably deny, no matter how much incense he burns. The Great Crusade was not conducted by 18 suns and 2 vague footnotes. There were 20 legions, each raised from the best of the Proto-Astartes, each bound to a distinct gene sire. They marched with the first expeditionary fleets. They leveled techno-barbarian fortresses. They silenced Xeno's empires that had survived since before Terra knew fire. They bled in oceans across 1,000,000 battlefields to turn the map of the galaxy from a patchwork of warring tyrannies into a single, unified tyranny. Among those legions, 2 now exist only as a designation, the Legion of the Second, the Legion of the 11th. That is all that remains in official script. A numeral in a list, an empty line in a heraldry chart, a vacant space in the great roll of honor. Their Primarchs are recorded as unknown. Not dead, not traitor, not martyr. Unknown. Their records are not lost by accident. They are not misfiled, awaiting some diligent archivist to uncover them. They have been cut out with surgical precision, like a tumor excised from the bone. This is not a simple purge. This is erasure. In the long, sprawling tapestry of Imperial history, there are purges, without number. There are dead worlds that still glow on Auspex, gone silent beneath sheets of glass. There are forgotten crusades, entire sectors whose names changed after some catastrophic failure or inconvenient deviation from sanctioned doctrine. Corpses pile up in every age until they become geology. These things are common. The Imperium is good at forgetting its mistakes by burying them under more dead. The lost Primarchs are not like that. Their absence is different in flavor, sharper and more deliberate. Even beings who should remember everything struggle to bring them to mind. There are demon princes of chaos who walked with the Primarchs in the days before the heresy, who remember the faces of void-born captains and mortal remembrances in excruciating detail, yet glaze over when asked about the brothers who never made it into the latter legends. In some half-remembered accounts, a Primarch pauses when listing his siblings, hesitates for a heartbeat as if skirting some invisible chasm in his own memory, then continues as though there were no gap. It is not the vagueness of age or the selective forgetfulness of trauma. It feels like something else, an anesthesia applied to reality itself. Only two beings in that distant age had the force of will and the psychic weight to attempt such a thing and make it hold. The master of mankind, Malcador, the Sigillite. The Emperor designed minds. He understood how to scar them. The Sigillite was his shadow, his knife in the dark, the architect of the Inquisition and the one entrusted with the key to humanity's worst vaults. If there is a psychic fog lying over the memories of the lost Primarchs, it is because those two chose for it to be there. Strip away rumor and hopeful fanfiction, and what you are left with is a very small, very hard flaw of fact. Two Primarchs existed. They had legions. Those legions took part in the Great Crusade. They were not latecomers shuffled in at the last minute or prototypes, abandoned before deployment. They fought. They bled. They won worlds in the Emperor's name. By the time the War Master turned and the galaxy tore itself into loyalist and traitor, both of those brothers and both of their legions were already gone. Whatever befell them was an old wound even before the first shell struck the walls of the palace. Beyond that, the text dissolves into implication and suggestion. This is where living in the universe of Warhammer 40,000 means learning how to read in three directions at once. There is what is established. There is what is canonical. There is what lives in the negative space between the two. A line in a codex that says a legion was lost to us forever is not the same as a campaign book that maps out a full timeline with deployment charts and casualty tables. A throwaway remark in a novel spoken by a character in a moment of rage is not the same as a cold sidebar in a rulebook, quietly laying down something the writers intend, never to contradict. The lore is a palimpsest. It is layers of ink and paint and blood, older lines showing through beneath the newer ones. Think about how you actually encounter the history of the Imperium, not as a neat chronicle, not as a saint's life written from start to finish in careful order. You get it in after-action reports scribbled by dying officers who did not understand the war they were in the re-edited memoirs of remembrancers whose work was purged and then reissued in bowdlerized form centuries after their deaths, in sermons screamed by preachers who learned their theology from half-rotted catechisms and hearsay, in canticles carved into the walls of scholar dormitories, by boys who have never even seen the sky, in the fractured visions of psychers chained to black ships. The lost Primarchs live inside that fracture. They are not just an amusing detail for lore scholars. For the survivors of the Great Crusade and the heresy, the knowledge that two of their brothers simply stopped existing is not a curiosity, it is an open wound. Imagine being a captain of the Astartes in that age, and knowing that a whole legion had marched beside you once. Knowing that those warriors had bled in the same storm of fire, that their Primarch had stood at your Primarch's side before the master of mankind. Then one day, a Sigillite's envoy comes to your ship. The banners of that legion are taken down. Their heraldry is burned. Their battle honors are struck from the rolls. You are told, very calmly, that you will never again speak their name. The Imperium teaches that Primarchs are angels of the Emperor made flesh. Yet here you are, living proof that even angels can be deemed failures, not merely killed in battle, not even condemned as traitors to be held up as cautionary exemplars, but deemed so unacceptable that their very existence is to be edited out of history. That is a deeper cruelty than any simple execution. That is annihilation of meaning. Behind that cruelty, you can feel the scale of the wars in which they must have vanished. The Great Crusade was not a polite sequence of skirmishes. It was a chain of apocalyptic events strung across the stars. There were campaigns where a single world ate 40 years of imperial lives, where a single theatre saw more human dead than the total population of ancient Terra. Expeditionary fleets did not die one by one. They died by the dozen, entire armadas swallowed by warp storms, or broken against alien empires whose names no longer appear on any map. In some of the worst xenocidal crusades, billions of mortal soldiers were not even the cost. They were the background detail, the dust thrown up by the collision of god engines and void warships. Somewhere inside that storm of attrition, 2 legions ended. Whether through defeat, corruption, sanction, or some hybrid horror of all three, does not change the scale. You can hide a lot of truth in a statistic that says that a particular xenocide cost an uncountable tally of dead and the extinction of several Astartes legions. You can bury a great many screams in the line that says that the Great Crusade came close to breaking under the pressure of a single nameless enemy. And so, we are left with silence dressed up as classification. There were 20, now there are 18. The 2nd and the 11th are listed as lost. Their Primarchs are unknown. Their records are expunged. That is all the Imperium is prepared to declare. The rest is shadows. This is the space we will walk. No one is going to hand you a neat answer tied with a purity seal. That would betray the nature of the setting as surely as resurrecting the Emperor and giving him a speech about hope. The mystery is not there to be solved. It is there to show you what kind of God would rather tear names out of reality than admit that his work was flawed. All that follows will move along that knife edge between text and speculation, between the lines that were written and the ones that were rubbed out. By following the silence around the 2nd and the 11th, you learn far more about the Master of Mankind, about the Imperium that still kills in his name, and about the grim, uncaring scale of this age than any simple reveal of 2 more gene-sired names could ever offer. The empty plinths are not where this story truly starts. They are only the most refined expression of a habit that is older than the Great Crusade, older than the Primarchs, older even than the first gene-forged legionary stepped into ceramite plate and called himself an Astartes. Before there were lost Primarchs, before there were bare pedestals in the palace and legion numerals quietly excised from the record, the Master of Mankind had already demonstrated exactly how he dealt with tools that no longer matched the shape of his design. You can trace the pattern back to Terra, when the world was still a graveyard of nations. Think of the unification era not as a prelude, but as a fully fledged age of nightmares in its own right. The maps of that time are slag. Techno-barbarian states squatted over the bones of old Earth like scabs. Their banners were radiation symbols and murder totems. Their coinage was rad-burnt flesh and slave chits. There were fortress cities that stretched from horizon to horizon, ringed in continent-spanning trench networks, their skies permanently occluded by the snarl of flak and ash. Void shields crackled over hive spires as crude artillery hammered them day after day, and half-functional macro cannons smuggled from derelict orbital platforms spat fire down into the boiling chaos below. Into that furnace the Emperor cast his first generation of weapons. The Thunder Warriors were never meant to last. They were not subtle. They were not stable. They were not beautiful in the way his later sons would be beautiful. They were slabs of vat-grown slaughter, huge even by later standards, wrapped in ugly, brutal armor and fed on a diet of war. Where a modern Astartes is a blade, the Thunder Warrior was a maul. They existed to crush, to break, to tear apart the walls of those techno-barbarian citadels and pile their rulers in pieces on the floor. Entire states died under their marching boots. Whole armies of baseline humans were trampled into mud as collateral. Their deaths neither recorded nor mourned, because the only metric that mattered in that age was whether a warlord's tower was still standing at the end of the day. By the time the Unification Wars reached their closing acts, Terra itself hardly resembled a world. It was a scar. Oceans choked with wreckage and chems, its air strata laced with the ghosts of old plagues and the buzzing of crippled scrapsats. In that ruin, the Thunder Warriors gathered for their great triumph, summoned to a last mustering beneath the shadow of the palace they had killed to raise. Imagine them. Colossal gene brutes, armor still stained with the blood and soot of 100 campaigns, believing themselves to be the chosen, the ones who had broken the backs of Terra's enemies and cleared the ground for the promised new age. They expected banners, medals, laurels. What they received was censure, and then death. The slaughter of the Thunder Warriors is one of those foundational atrocities that the Imperium does not sing about in its cathedrals. It sits down in the dark alongside the other things that must be kept, if not secret, then at least out of the way of impressionable eyes. The Emperor looked upon his first generation of gene soldiers and saw that they were flawed. Their bodies decayed too quickly, burned out by the very augmentations that made them mighty. Their minds were too wild, their loyalty too coarse. They were a means to an end, and the end had been achieved. So he did what he always does when a tool no longer fits his hand. He discarded it. Whether they died under the bolt and blade of the Golden Warriors, who would later stand at his side, whether they were fed into the gene labs as unwilling donors, whether some few limped away into hiding to degenerate in the underhives, is almost incidental. The important point, the one that echoes forward, is that the master of mankind did not hesitate. These were his creations, born from his science and guided by his hand, and he had them killed when they ceased to be useful. Not because they had rebelled, not because they had turned to the warp, but because they were obsolete. This is the core of the pattern, iterative design by way of massacre. The Emperor does not cling sentimentally to his failures. He refines. The Thunder Warriors are replaced by the Astartes, a second generation of gene warriors with cleaner lines, more controlled minds, better stability. The proto-legions on Terra are tested, then culled, their worst gene line aberrations quietly destroyed. The Primarch project takes that refinement and drives it further, crafting not merely soldiers, but demigod generals whose very presence is a weapon. Each stage builds on the corpses of the previous one. It is tempting to imagine that once he reached the Primarchs, he stopped. That the 20 suns were the final, flawless iteration. That is the propaganda version, the devotional fresco painted on chapel walls in a million hives. But you have already walked past the empty plinths in the palace in your mind. You know better. The Emperor's willingness to murder his own creations did not end with the Thunder Warriors. It merely became more precise, more hidden, clothed in legal language and metaphysical intent. Among the few surviving hints that slip past the censors, one word surfaces again and again when veterans of that age speak of the fate of the missing legions. Sanction. Not defeat, not loss, not even betrayal. Sanction. It is a cold word, administrative and final, the language of sentence and judgment. When one of the surviving Primarchs speaks of it, there is more than grief in his tone. There is an understanding that what befell the 2nd and the 11th was not the simple chaos of war, but a deliberate act. A closing of the ledger, a decision taken at the highest conceivable level that these bloodlines were to be ended. To carry out a sanction of that magnitude requires more than a decree shouted in a war zone. It needs a mechanism. It needs the sigillite. Malcador sits at the Emperor's shoulder in all the ancient depictions. robed and hooded, a man among giants, and yet somehow more frightening than any of them. If the Emperor is the one who decides that something will be erased, Malcador is the one who writes the orders and makes sure that they are obeyed. Among the whispered fragments that emerge from the age of the Great Crusade are references to black scrolls carried by his agents, orders of dissolution, sealed with sigils that no one else was permitted to use. These are not the standard remits of censure-handed, out-to-mortal commanders who have failed in their duty. These are rare things, invoked only a handful of times before the heresy. When such a scroll arrives, it does not simply call for a commander's removal or a legion's redeployment. It calls for unmaking, gene stock to be destroyed, heraldry to be struck from armor, banners to be burned, names to be taken from the rolls and made unknown. Whatever precise truth lies behind the rumors, the existence of such instruments tells you something vital. Even at that altitude where Primarchs and legions are the counters used to play war across the stars, erasing one of them requires a special, exceptional writ. The violence is only the first part. Killing warriors is easy. The Imperium does that, whether it wants to or not. The real work begins afterwards, in the bureaucratic aftershock. Imagine the scale of the machine that has to move when an entire legion is sanctioned. Archivists are silenced, some paid in promotions, others in shallow graves. Remembrance's works are seized and pulped, their picked captures confiscated and either destroyed or refiled under new designations. Fleet logs are recalled and amended. Where once the 2nd or the 11th stood in a line of triumphant deployments, now there is a gap, or a different numeral entirely. Munitorum manifests, administratum ledgers, mechanicum exchange tithes, all of them quietly rewritten so that future generations will see only what they are meant to see. Picture a planetary monument, some conquered hive world, where a colossal frieze was carved to show the Emperor and his sons taking the surrender of a broken warlord. The artist chiseled every plate and every laurel, copying from living models. In the original, the unknown Primarch stands there among his brothers, his armor and features distinct. Now, centuries later, a work party under the supervision of a faceless arbitrator arrives. They bring chisels and auspex and acid. They strip that figure away, cutting back to bare rock. Then a new artisan squad comes, draping the wound in marble, perhaps carving an aquila over the scar or another, more acceptable figure in his place. The monument still stands. Pilgrims still weep in its shadow. But what it records is no longer an honest moment. It is comfort fiction, a visual lie maintained because the truth is no longer convenient. This is the heart of imperial history. The frescoes, the quotes, the grandiose campaign summaries are not there to be accurate. They are there to be useful. They tell a story of an age of heroes marching in perfect step behind a flawless leader, of a great crusade that surged from victory to victory with only one regrettable detour into fratricide when Horus listened to the wrong voices. There is no room in that story for brothers who walked too far off script and had to be removed from the cast list. Once you understand this, the Lost Primarchs stop looking like a glitch in the code and start looking like proof that the code is working exactly as intended. The Imperium does not debate inconvenient truths. It does not hold open inquiries and publish damning reports. It does not erect statues to its own mistakes and apologize beneath them. When something threatens the narrative, it is edited out. The Thunder Warriors were useful until they were not, so they died on the steps of a palace they had helped build. The 2nd and the 11th were useful until they were not, so their legions disappeared into the same kind of system that turns a massacre into a footnote and an entire genocide into a single line on a star chart. If a Primarch and all his sons are to be removed, it will not happen in some minor clash over a border. It will take place in a crucible so enormous that even such a loss can be disguised as acceptable attrition. A war where expeditionary fleets vanish, not by ones or twos, but by scores. A campaign where the death of several legions can be wrapped inside a single phrase about the heaviest cost the Imperium has ever borne. Somewhere out there in the long, murderous history of the Great Crusade are xenocides and black campaigns that came close to breaking the whole project. They are where you must look if you want to feel the heat that burned away the 2nd and the 11th, even if you never see the moment of their ending. And so, the question hangs over the empty plinths and the scrubbed mosaics like a pall. The master of mankind killed his first generation of warriors as soon as they no longer served his purposes. He did not weep. He did not stop. When faced with later failures, with sons whose nature did not fit the shifting silhouette of his vision, he reached for sharper tools and more subtle methods, but the underlying act remained the same. If he could do that to those who had won him terror, if he could look upon his own living legends and see only flawed prototypes, then what exactly would he balk at when it came time to deal with his wayward Primarchs? How far would he go to correct a mistake he himself had made? And what horrors would he quietly author in the name of protecting a future that only he was ever allowed to see? There are not many wars that could kill a Primarch and make the galaxy shrug. The Great Crusade burned across the stars for centuries, and in that time, 1,000 crusades rose and fell. 1,000 nameless exterminations wiped whole cultures into dust. Most of those slaughters, for all their horror, were still too small. You cannot quietly lose a son of the Emperor in a border skirmish. You cannot misplace a legion in a minor cleansing action. To hide the death or erasure of a Primarch, you need a furnace vast enough that even such a catastrophe is only one more coal thrown into the fire. When you start sorting the wars of that age by sheer, obscene scale, the list shrinks very quickly. A few truly titanic campaigns stare back at you from the redacted pages. Among them, one stands at the center like a black sun. The Rangdan Xenocides were not a single battle, not even a single war. They were a series of extermination campaigns waged in the distant eastern reaches of the galaxy in the late 30th millennium, at the height of the Great Crusade's apparent strength. Official texts describe them almost grudgingly, as if the words taste bad even to the parchment. Over the course of those xenocides, not mere thousands, but tens of thousands of Astartes died, a number counted in the high tens of thousands at the very least. Uncounted millions of the Imperial army burned beside them. Dozens of Titan legions walked into those campaigns and never returned. Entire expeditionary fleets vanished, stripped to atoms in the dark. The Rangda and their slave cohorts were believed wiped out when it was over, but that phrase, believed wiped out, hangs awkwardly in the air, like a prayer half-spoken and quickly abandoned. The few surviving descriptions of the Rangda make them sound less like a single species and more like a phantasm that happened to an entire region of space. Towering Xenos of monstrous appearance and terrifying intellect, their seat of power along the edge of the galaxy in the halo stars, wielding technologies that could stand beside those of the Imperium without flinching. They were not a petty regional power to be rolled over and forgotten. They were conquerors and destroyers in their own right, and when the Great Crusade's expeditionary fleets finally breached the eastern fringe, they drew the Rangda's gaze like moths drawing the attention of a predator. Picture that war not as lines on a map, but as a spreading darkness. Scores of systems fell into silence, their astropathic choirs first screaming, then going dead. Whole constellations of human and Xenos worlds alike went out one by one, as if a child were pinching the lights off a star chart. In space, battles were fought between armadas so large that even the meticulous administratum clerks can only bring themselves to write phrases like entire fleets lost, as if the exact number is an obscenity best left unspoken. Imagine thousands of capital ships trading blows, their lance batteries stitching lines of fire across the void, their plasma drives rupturing into miniature suns as they die. Whole task forces translated into warp storms that had not been there before, their last screams smeared into the immaterium. On the ground, the war was worse. There were worlds where the only possible strategy was to draw a line around an entire continent and declare it already dead. then drop enough ordnance to turn mountains into glass. Once the Titans deployed, whole ranges were ground down under their metal feet. God machines from dozens of mighty legios strode into those killing fields and bled out there, reactor cores tearing open, princeps minds burning away in their thrones. When the tally is written in phrases like dozens of Titan legions lost, you are looking at a slaughter that would, in any sane civilization, be the defining trauma of all recorded history. This is the crucible in which many lore readers place the 2nd and the 11th. The timing fits uncomfortably well. The Xenocides take place in that window at the crest of the Crusades' power, late enough that most of the Primarchs have been found and set to their tasks, early enough that the heresy itself is still a nightmare waiting beyond the horizon. In later accounts, there are hints that entire legions, not merely scattered companies, were lost in those campaigns. The black books of the heresy era speak of legions swallowed by the Rangdan Wars, and one of the great campaign tomes explicitly suggests that one or both of the unknown legions met their doom there, though the relevant passages are sheathed in thick bars of redaction. Add to that the language already clinging to the lost Primarchs like grave dust: sanctioned, purged, forgotten, add in the way certain. The regimental accounts quietly mention the 2nd and the 11th as having taken part in the Xenocides, only for later editions to remove those numerals altogether. Add the fans' own habitual habit of naming the missing legions the Purged and the Forgotten, not because some holy terror decree says so, but because those words feel right in the mouth when you picture legions drowned in a war like this. There is no single smoking bolt shell of cannon that says the Rangdan killed the lost Primarchs. But the smoke coming off that conflict smells very much like a place where something truly unspeakable could happen and then be buried. Speculation grows in that soil. It is not wild, unmoored guesswork. It is guided by the known shape of the Xenocides. The Rangda were not just brutes with big guns. They wielded weapons that struck at the mind and the soul. There are scattered hints of mind plagues, of horror engines that did not simply kill, but rewrote those they touched. It is not hard to imagine a Primarch's gene line discovering, too late, that some quirk in its psychic architecture made it especially vulnerable to such attacks. Picture a legion whose hypnodoctrination, normally their shield, becomes the very channel through which Xenos influence flows. Picture entire cohorts of Astartes turning their bolters on their own allies, not because they have made a conscious choice to betray, but because something from the halo stars is speaking directly inside their thoughts. In one branch of this speculative tree, a Primarch watches his sons fall one by one to an infection that is not biological and not purely warp-born, something in between, something new. In another, he is the first to be touched, his prodigious mind cracked and reassembled by contact with an intellect as cold and alien as the dying suns around the Rangdan's home clusters. There are stories whispered in data vaults and forum archives of a Primarch who began to show too much fascination, too much empathy for the enemy's weapons and ways of thought, until the Emperor himself had to intervene. None of this is confirmed. All of it aligns with the one hard fact you keep circling back to. However the 2nd and the 11th fell, their fall was something the Imperium could never risk repeating or inspiring. It was not enough to mark them as dead. They had to be erased, but it would be a mistake to cage both lost legions inside one war. The Great Crusade's reach went further than the Rangdan front, and the galaxy had more nightmares to offer. On the ragged edges of the map lay regions like the Ghoul Stars, where the light of human dominance frayed and the void grew full of things that should not exist. Some sectors were conquered in the Emperor's name during that early age, their populations bent beneath new banners, only for those holdings to be reclaimed by forces so unnatural that the surviving records can only refer to them as nightmare engines and star-spawned plagues. Whole clusters there burned in events like the Pale Wasting, a horror so severe that even the chapters who fought in it later stripped their own chronicles clean of detail. Elsewhere, crusades pushed out into intergalactic voids, following fragmentary star charts toward promises of lost human colonies or forbidden knowledge. Some of those fleets simply never came back. In the neat, bowdlerized summaries issued centuries later, you will see only respectful phrases about lost expeditions and the toll of the long war. You will not see the moment when some Primarch realized that the warp storms surrounding his target region had begun to answer his thoughts, or when a legion found that their Vox traffic was being replied to by voices claiming to be their own future selves. You will not see the breaking points, because those are precisely the details that would make later generations ask questions, and questions are the one thing the Imperium cannot abide. All of these cataclysms share a peculiar trait in the written record. For all their magnitude, for all the lives and engines and worlds burned in them, they are small on the page. The Rangdan Xenocides, which claimed enough Astartes and Titans to cripple several first founding chapters in later ages, are described as a footnote, a paragraph tucked between more familiar tales of the Great Crusade's onward march. The ghoul-haunted plagues and nightmares on the Imperial frontier become a handful of ominous sentences in a side column. The greatest traumas of the setting often come to us as a boxed-out timeline entry or a throwaway reminiscence in a novel, some veteran quietly mentioning the time he watched multiple legions die and then changing the subject. That smallness is not an accident. It is part of the horror. The Imperium is so large, so steeped in war, that even events that would define entire civilizations elsewhere are just one more line item in an overfull ledger. Bring the scale back down, just for a moment. Stand on the bridge of an Imperial Army flagship at the height of the Xenocides. You are a Lord Commander, decorated, exhausted, half-deaf from too many bombardments. You have been fighting the Rangda and their thralls for longer than you care to remember. Your order of battle manifests are kept updated by a small army of aides who practically live inside the cogitator banks.
Be sure to subscribe. You know you want to. If you don't, you'll be sent into the void and nobody will find you for the rest of your life. So go, be sure to subscribe. Remember, subscribe.
Every major engagement, you check the disposition of the legions attached to your theatre. You know their numerals and their colours by heart. You have seen their banners on a dozen ash-choked fields. One day, for no reason you have been told, the manifest you receive lists 18 Astartes legions instead of 19 or 20. The numerals run neatly from the 1st to the 20th, but one of them is missing. The 2nd or the 11th, whichever was assigned to your front, is simply not there. The names of its companies have been replaced by blank spaces. The Vox, designations that once led to its strike cruisers now return only polite error chimes. When you query this, an envoy from the Sigillite arrives with new documents bearing fresh seals, and a look in his eyes that says that this conversation is not going to go anywhere you like. You are told that your previous manifests were in error. You are told that there was never a legion with that numeral attached to your front. You are told that you will sign the new papers and never raise this topic again. On the worlds you have taken, masons are ordered to remove a single set of heraldic sigils from victory arches. Painters are told to repaint one figure on triumphal murals in a different shade of armor, to make the ranks look right. In the camps, remembrances are quietly culled, the ones with too many sketches or too many questions taken aside and reassigned to other fronts, or simply not seen again. Astartes of other legions are instructed that they will not speak of their missing brothers, under any circumstance, on pain of censure that even they fear. You watch an entire colour disappear from the vast palette of the Crusade, and you are expected to pretend you never saw it. Even among the demigods, the ground trembles when that absence is probed. There are accounts from the heresy era of fortress lords standing in their high towers, speaking in rare moments of candour about the brothers they have lost. One such Primarch, a man of stone and fire, muses grimly about the warning that the fates of the forgotten legions should have given them all. The Sigillite's reaction is swift and absolute. The subject is shut down with a few chosen words, lost to us forever. That is all that will be said. even among those who once shared trenches and council chambers with the missing. Within the universe, as much as outside it, the topic is a live minefield, skirted carefully by those who know where the bones are buried. So you stand surrounded by these overlapping silences. You know now that there were wars large enough to swallow legions whole, campaigns so apocalyptic that the deaths of Primarchs could be disguised as the cost of doing business. You know that the Great Crusade fought enemies who attacked not just bodies but identities, who warped records and warped minds in equal measure. You know that the Imperium's response when confronted with a truth it cannot allow is to burn that truth, smear its ashes across the pages of other disasters, and stamp an Aquila over the stain. No one has ever shown you the precise moment when the 2nd or the 11th died. There is no canonical scene of a Primarch's last stand against the Rangda or some other nameless horror. No officially sanctioned picture of his body falling beneath a brother's blade or into the light of the Emperor's judgment. Instead, you are handed these fragments, casualty figures that beg a belief, hints of entire legions lost, a handful of redacted passages, a few tight-lipped quotes about sanctions and failures. It is enough. You can see the shape of the missing event by the crater it left behind. There are wars vast enough to bury such a story beneath the ashes of 1 billion dead. And there is an Imperium more than willing to shovel those ashes over whatever truth once screamed beneath them. The wars of the Great Crusade burn hot in the mind. It is easy to lose yourself in the glare of extermination fleets and xenocides, in the scream of titans and the thunder of orbital fire. But if you want to understand how the lost Primarchs vanished from history, you have to step back from the front lines and look at the words themselves. You have to turn away from the battlefield and sit in the dust with the books, the rule texts, the campaign chronicles, the novels and their hushed asides, and start pulling at the threads. This is not as dramatic as watching a god in armor die under alien guns. It is quieter and, in its way, far more frightening. Because when you examine the lines that actually mention the Forgotten Brothers, what you find is not a clean, solid explanation. You find repetition and contradiction, hard edges and smudged ink, deliberate holes that have been left in place and painted around. The first image you keep tripping over is the same one that anchored everything earlier, the Great Hall within the Imperial Palace on Holy Terror, with its avenue of Primarch statues. Source after source returns to that motif. Somewhere within the labyrinth of the palace stand 20 massive plinths, arranged like vertebrae down the spine of a sacred processional way. On 18 of them, the demigods of the Great Crusade are frozen in stone, captured in idealized poses of authority and triumph. On 2, there is nothing at all. Crucially, those 2 empty stone blocks are not described as recently vacated. In the short tale of Tower and Storm that shows us Rogel Dawn walking the walls and contemplating the coming siege, we are told that the 2nd and the 11th plinths had been vacant for a long time. No one ever spoke of those 2 absent brothers, and Dawn thinks of their separate tragedies as oddities, aberrations that perhaps should have been heeded as warnings. That phrase, vacant for a long time, matters. It anchors the moment. By the time the War Master has turned and the traitor fleets are burning their way inward, the statues are not missing because of the heresy. They have been missing for years. The tragedies that emptied those plinths are already history to the Primarchs who remain. They are scars on scars. That shared description, echoed in lexicons and lore compilations that draw on the same root text, is what makes the empty plinths one of the most solid pieces of stone in an otherwise shifting landscape. From there, your eye is drawn to the language used whenever anyone dares to allude to the missing legions more directly. They are not called the dead. They are not even usually called traitors. The terms that surface instead are phrases like forgotten tragedies and lost to us forever. The first cast them as part of that endless roll of disasters the Imperium would rather not look at directly. The second is more disturbing. In that same tale of lightning and tower, and again in commentary around it, we hear Malcador the Sigillite warning Dawn not to even think of the absent legions when the Imperial fist entertains, for a moment, the thought that more brothers might join the loyalist cause. "They are lost to us forever," the sigillite says, and there is something in that wording that feels very carefully chosen. Lost to us forever does not quite sound like dead. It sounds like sealed, removed, placed beyond reach by deliberate act. When later commentaries gloss those lines, they often speak of the purged and the forgotten, as if they were two distinct fates rather than a single shared catastrophe. The way the quotes are framed suggests that the second and the 11th did not die together in a single blaze of mutual ruin, but in separate incidents, each a warning on its own. Once you have that in your hands, you turn to the question of when these brothers lived and when they fell. That means wrestling with the rediscovery order, a topic that has caused more arguments among lawkeepers than some entire campaigns. On one side, you have neat charts, compiled from sidebars and throwaway lines, that attempt to place each Primarch along a timeline spanning a century and a half, complete with numbered rediscovery slots. On the other, you have narrative accounts that rub awkwardly against those charts and refuse to line up. Take Corvus Corax and his recollections in Deliverance Lost. When the Raven Lord remembers his first meeting with his father, he recalls the Emperor speaking as though most of his brothers have already been found, and hinting that some are already lost. That would place the erasure of at least one missing legion firmly. In the late Great Crusade, long before Istvan and Calth and Prospero shattered the illusion of unity, yet those same lines can be passed in different ways. Some readers insist that the Emperor, in that scene, is not speaking of the 2nd and the 11th at all, but of other as yet undiscovered brothers, such as Alpharius. Others argue the opposite, seeing the conversation as confirmation that the lost Primarchs had already been cut out of the picture by the time Corax is brought into the fold. The fact that respectable voices on both sides can point to the same sentence and read two conflicting truths from it tells you something important about how these texts are built. They are not constructed as legal documents. They are mood pieces and character sketches first, exact chronologies a distant second. Ambiguity is not a flaw in them, it is a feature. If you step back from the individual quotation and look at the pattern as a whole, a clearer outline does emerge. Almost every serious summary that tries to pull the strands together agrees on a few points. The Primarch project spanned well over a century. Corax was found very late in that sequence, after most of his brothers had already been reclaimed and set at the head of their legions. By the time the Emperor comes alone to the prison moon of Lycaeus, at least one, and likely both, of the lost legions have already been removed from the board. Their erasure belongs to the late Great Crusade, contemporary with the great xenocidal campaigns out on the galactic fringes, not to the chaotic years of open civil war that follow. Here is where it helps to remember the distinction between what is established and what is canonical that we have been circling since the beginning. A single stray line in a novella can be overruled or quietly ignored by later texts. A repeated image, echoed across multiple books and multiple product lines, is much harder to dislodge. The empty plinths, the phrase about them being long, vacant, the careful avoidance of calling the missing brothers dead. These things are established. They recur. They are picked up by codex sidebars, by campaign book asides, by lore essays, and by the wikis that consolidate studio material. They are treated as bedrock. By contrast, the exact sequence in which Corax comes home compared to this or that brother lives in a fog of minor contradictions and editorial oversight. It is interesting, but it is not as heavy. When you apply that lens to every scrap of writing that touches the lost Primarchs, a roughly coherent core of truth slowly appears. There were two legions. They had Primarchs. Those legions fought in the Great Crusade. Their Primarchs were not missing, not theoretical, but found and bloody-handed and real. At some point before the heresy truly begins, each of those legions suffers a separate, catastrophic failure. Whatever else may be argued, the Emperor and his sigillite respond by sanctioning them. That word has weight, now. In one volcanic-tinged tale, Vulcan himself uses sanction to describe what befell the missing brothers, and other texts mention a class of document, the Black Scroll, invoked only twice before the heresy to dissolve a legion utterly. This is how a single loaded term, dropped into dialogue, fans out into an entire continent of theory. Sanction is not a battlefield word. It is a word of courts and councils, of sentencing. When you combine it with the notion of black scrolls carried to a legion's homeworld, ordering the dismantling of its infrastructure and the destruction or absorption of its gene stock, you get a picture of dissolution by design. No text ever comes out and says, "These scrolls were used on the 2nd and the 11th. They do not have to." The implications sit there, humming quietly, waiting for anyone willing to put their ear to the page. And then there are the negative facts, the things that refuse to resolve into any kind of detail, no matter how hard you stare. When you look up the 2 unknown legions in any of the major compendia that aggregate official lore, you find the same stark list. No names, no homeworlds, no known battle honors, no color schemes or heraldic devices. Nothing is known for sure about the names of the legions, their primarchs, their homeworlds, or their ultimate fate. That sentence, in one form or another, is as close to a catechism as you get. It appears again and again, sometimes with a little more emphasis on the records being expunged, sometimes on the destruction of their archives, but always with that same chill. Nothing is known for sure. In a setting where even the most obscure successor chapter can usually claim half a page of invented heraldry, and a few lines about some minor crusade, the refusal to give the Lost Legion so much as a paint scheme is loud. It is not an oversight. It is an instruction. Artists are not meant to draw them. Players are not meant to paint them as official canon. Authors are not meant to write a neatly labeled novel called The 11th Primarch and slot it into the chronology. The void is itself part of the design. This is where the metastructure peeks through the diegesis. The Lost Primarchs serve several functions at once. Within the universe, they are cautionary whispers about what happens to demigods who stray too far from the Emperor's vision. Warnings that even those made in his image can be excised if they displease him. From the point of view of the writers, they are safety valves and anchor points. They provide a permanent blind spot, a place where hints and allusions and dark jokes can be planted without ever risking a definitive answer. They leave space for players to imagine and invent their own pre-heresy legions on the gaming table under the umbrella of the unknown, while the official narrative keeps its options open. If a studio author wants to convey that a given Primarch is speaking more honestly than usual, he can have that. Character glance at the empty plinths and fall silent. If he wants to hint at the kind of crimes that might provoke the Emperor to personal intervention, he can have a veteran mention that such a thing has happened before, and let the reader fill in the missing numerals on their own. The mystery is a tool. It shapes tone. It reminds everyone, constantly, that there are limits to knowledge even in a universe where gods walk, and that some of those limits exist because someone with unimaginable power put them there on purpose. By the time you reach this point, the outlines of the bedrock should be clear. There were 2 brothers. They had legions. Those legions fought, then fell, in tragically separate ways. Their statues in the palace were removed long before the traitor fleet ever burned a path for terror. Their records were not mislaid. They were systematically destroyed. The surviving Primarchs speak of them rarely, and when they do, it is with words that suggest judgment, not simple loss. The official compilations, when forced to address them, throw up their hands and write unknown, and they do so consistently enough that you can trust the ignorance itself as a meaningful fact. Everything beyond that is fog, and that is where we go next. In the final movement, we leave the solid flagstones of text and step out into the shifting ground of theory. Not to crown one wild guess as truth, but to look at the most compelling possibilities and ask a different question. Not who the Lost Primarchs were, or exactly how they died, but what the stories we tell about them reveal about the master of mankind, about his attitude to his own creations, and about the grimdark logic of a universe where even the empty spaces in history bleed. There is a point you reach, if you care about this setting for long enough, where the question stops being who were the lost Primarchs and becomes something sharper. Not what were their names, what color did they paint their armor, what worlds did they win. Those are surface curiosities. The deeper question is this: why did the people who make this universe decide to leave those spaces blank and then build so much meaning out of the blanks themselves? The Imperium is a cathedral made of partial truths and propaganda. Its history has been written, rewritten, redacted, painted over, and sung to sleep 1,000 times. Every story you are handed about the age of the Primarchs has passed through the filters of dogma, cowardice, and the simple human urge to make sense of chaos. In that environment, the lost Primarchs are the purest mystery you can have. They are not an unknown because the writers forgot to fill them in. They are unknown because someone chose to carve out 2 precise voids and then deliberately walk away. You can see that choice in what is not said as much as in what is said. Nowhere is there a neat little panel that says, "This brother did this, and so he was struck from the record." Instead, the hints and legends and offhand remarks cluster into families of theory. The most common of those, the one you hear repeated in 1,000 conversations between lawkeepers hunched over their books and screens, says that one of the lost Primarchs fell to chaos long before Horus ever did, and that the Emperor responded the way he always responds to an experiment gone wrong, with annihilation. In that vision, an early son is exposed to the warp in the wrong way, or in the wrong place, or with the wrong temper of soul, and the corruption that later swallowed half the legions finds its first purchase in him. He is not the charismatic fulcrum that Horus will become, not the carefully primed agent of a grand betrayal, but something messier and more embarrassing, a failed test, an early warning that the Emperor chooses to treat as a contained incident rather than as a sign that the entire edifice is flawed. The brother falls, his legion follows, whether willingly or because their Genesire's shadow warps everything it touches. The Emperor comes with his custodian guard and his sigillite, and the killing is done quickly. Worlds that knew that Legion's banners burn. Their name is scraped off the plinth. The record is shut. The heresy, in that interpretation, has already begun. It is simply not called that yet. If you are going to embrace that version for one brother, there is an instinctive desire to balance it with the opposite for the other. Stories grow up about the second lost Primarch who did not fall in the same way, whose crime was not worship of the ruinous powers, but something the Imperium considers even less forgivable: softness, ideological deviation, refusal to obey. Here you find tales of a Primarch who took the Emperor's dream of unity at face value and balked at the methods needed to enforce it. A son who looked at a compliant world and decided that mass repression and cultural obliteration were unnecessary, that perhaps a more generous rule would serve better. Or a Primarch who refused an order to exterminate a defeated Xenos race down to the infant and the egg, who stayed his legion's guns when told to fire on his own human allies. In those narratives, the Emperor's reaction is not the righteous wrath he shows traitors in the open days of the heresy, but the cold calculation that attends any malfunctioning tool. A Primarch who cannot be relied upon to enact orders without question is a liability on the scale of entire sectors. The loyal sons who later burn half the galaxy at his command do so precisely because they do not flinch when ordered to slaughter. A brother who hesitates, who weighs morality against command, strikes at the root of that terrible certainty. So he is removed, not denounced as a traitor to be pointed at in sermons, but quietly, surgically excised. His death is filed under unfortunate necessity. His legion is broken, scattered, their gene stock reprocessed or destroyed. His very name becomes a breach in a sentence that other Primarchs step around when they speak. Wrapped through both of those broad categories of theory, the shadow of the Rangdan Xenocides lingers. Once you accept that those wars could swallow legions whole without disturbing the wider narrative, it becomes brutally easy to graft the stories of the lost Primarchs onto them. In this speculative light, the Xenos of the Halo stars become more than just another genocidal foe. They become the authors of the first great primarchal catastrophe. Perhaps one of the Emperor's sons led his legion into that war and found that their very gene design reacted badly to Rangdan weapons. Bioalchemy that washed off other legions like toxic rain soaked into his sons and rewrote them. Hypnodoctrination patterns carefully calibrated in the labs of Luna turned out to resonate perfectly with alien frequencies that dismantled personality and rebuilt it as a puppet. Imagine an entire legion waking from sleep on their ships, realizing that their loyalties have been softly twisted in the night. Not a dramatic heel turn like the future War Master, but a slow, cancerous drift. By the time the Emperor understands what has happened, too many of them are compromised. Their Primarch, immune or merely slower to fall, is left standing among a host that can no longer be trusted. In that scenario, sanction is not simple punishment. It is mercy of a kind, a culling to prevent the infection from radiating outward through gene seed and training cadres, and the 1,000 other channels by which legions seed their doctrines into the wider war machine. The Lost Legion dies in the Rangdan fires, and its shame is buried beneath casualty figures already so monstrous that one more line on the tally is invisible. Or perhaps the horror runs the other way. Perhaps it is the Primarch himself who is broken by contact with alien minds, while his legion remains whole and loyal. A god in armor comes back from some starstruck campaign in the Eastern Marches, speaking in a voice that is not quite his own, proposing strategies and pacts that feel wrong even to ears used to the Emperor's most ruthless calculus. When the inevitable confrontation comes, the Emperor is forced to choose between killing a beloved son who has been reshaped into something alien and trying to salvage him at the risk of contaminating every other part of his design. You already know how he deals with mistakes. Then there is the folded legion idea, half a joke and half a serious attempt to make sense of the numbers. Players have long noticed that some first founding chapters have oddly swollen families, an unusually large number of successors compared to their brothers. Add to that a few scattered hints about legions reforged in the aftermath of unseen disasters, and you get whispers that not all of the Lost Sons' warriors were actually killed. In this suggestion, the Emperor and his Sigillite are too pragmatic to waste viable gene seed. The condemned legion is broken up, its colors burned, its symbols forbidden, but its surviving warriors and stock are quietly rebadged, folded into another gene line under new heraldry. The 13th Legion's vast web of descendants begins to look through that lens, less like simple popularity and more like a vast graveyard where the ghosts of the 2nd or the 11th march under borrowed banners. Beyond these relatively disciplined constructions lies the funhouse. The wilder corners of the community have thrown up possibilities that range from the merely unlikely to the outright metaphysical. Somewhere on the edge of the galaxy, they say, a forgotten Primarch still stands guard at a gate that cannot be allowed to fall, sealed there by his father's own hand and cut off from the rest of creation. Another theory imagines a lost son who embraced damnation, but did so in a way that paradoxically preserved his loyalty, becoming a demon prince who still fights for humanity from within the warp, too dangerous and too theologically troubling to ever be acknowledged. Others tie the vanished brothers to pariah gene experiments gone catastrophically wrong, whole legions of blanks whose presence spoiled every plan they touched, forcing the Emperor to throw the entire project into the fire. There are even tales that place a lost Primarch in the unlit reaches of the webway, a chained guardian or prisoner in the broken corridors of the Emperor's greatest failed work. None of these are likely in light of the current mass of text. Most of them contradict some other, more sober piece of lore. Their purpose is not to be right. Their purpose is to explore the edges of what the setting feels like it can contain. Each one is a story seed that says something about what people expect from the master of mankind and his broken family. A secret loyalist demon prince implies an emperor who is willing to exploit chaos even as he damns it. A Primarch, exiled to guard a hidden gate, implies a vision of sacrifice and ruthless compartmentalization that matches the tone of the wider heresy. Even the goofiest suggestions, when you look at them sideways, are ways of thinking about themes. That brings you back to the feeling that hangs over the empty plinths and the redacted passages. Regret, uncertainty, the knowledge that whole lifetimes of loyalty and pain have been deleted so thoroughly that only the shape of the deletion remains. You are not meant to be satisfied here. You are meant to feel the unease of gaps in supposedly absolute history, to understand that if two legions that once shook worlds can be erased like errant lines on a data slate, then anything can. The emotional weight of that absence, the discomfort it creates, is more important than any tidy reveal a studio might one day be tempted to offer. If someone were to publish a definitive list of names and colours and campaign honours for the 2nd and the 11th, the mystery would die, and with it, a little piece of what makes this universe feel as hostile and unfinished as it should. Seen through that lens, the Lost Primarchs are not an anomaly at all. They are the ultimate expression of the Emperor's established pattern. He uses what he makes as long as it serves, and then he discards it, whether it is a line of unstable thunder warriors who won him terror, a gene-crafted monster legion that weathered the worst xenocides in history, or a beloved son who happened to stand in the wrong place when his father's long game required a sacrifice. In a cosmos where even gods in armor can become failed prototypes, the erasure of the 2nd and the 11th is less a shocking exception, and more a brutally logical continuation. Meanwhile, the written universe continues to grow outward. New novels and campaign arcs pour sand into the cracks between the Great Crusade and the Heresy, into the long, bitter years of the Scouring and the haunted centuries that follow. With each expansion, writers find new ways to paint around the blind spots. Another Primarch pauses before the empty plinths. Another veteran hints darkly that the tragedy of the missing brothers should have warned them all. Another history tome mentions, in an aside, that certain records from a given theatre were sealed on orders from the sigillite and never reopened. The mystery is fed without ever being resolved, the way a shrine is maintained without anyone needing to know what bones are buried under it. That is the grimdark punchline. In this galaxy, a war that kills tens of thousands of transhuman warriors and millions upon millions of mortals can end up as a side note in a campaign book, a line in a timeline that most readers skim past on their way to the next big picture of a Titan firing its guns. In that context, the idea that two Primarchs and their entire legions could vanish into the background noise is not just plausible, it feels inevitable. It would almost be stranger if there were not such blank spaces, given the sheer volume of ash the Imperium kicks up every time it moves. So you return, in the end, to the image that has anchored all of this. A hall in the heart of the palace on Terra. 18 statues standing in imperious silence, carved into the likeness of beings who burned across the stars. 2 plinths left bare, polished until they gleam, their emptiness more eloquent than any inscription. Somewhere out beyond those stones lie the echoes of campaigns fought by uncountable billions under banners that no one is allowed to remember. The soil of 1,000 worlds is rich with the blood of warriors who march behind symbols that have been erased. Their sacrifices bought nothing more than the right to be forgotten. In the Imperium of man, even the greatest heroes can be unmade in this way. Not just killed, not just vilified, but reduced to a silence so absolute that only those carefully maintained absences hint that something went terribly, irreparably wrong,